Hi, everyone. Welcome to your eighth and final module. So this module, we're going to be discussing positionality and its relationship to conceptual and theoretical frameworks. So I want you to come into this module thinking about your existing positionality statement, not as a finished product, but as something that's living. So we're going to figure out how to deepen it and, more importantly, how to carry it through your dissertation work. Okay, so before we get started, just a quick warm up. So think about the reading that you did this week, the one that you chose. So you chose from a list of readings. Go ahead and open your existing positionality statement and take a look at it. Um, what do you think you're doing well in your positionality statement? Just thinking about all of the readings that you've done on positionality and the one that you chose to do for this week. Okay, so I hope one thing that's come across from EDD 712 and from the readings that you've done and the work that you've done with your chairs is that positionality is not just a box that you're checking. It's not a paragraph or section in your dissertation where you're kind of listing your identities and moving on. Positionality should be shaping your research from the very beginning. It does, whether you think about it or not, or whether you include the section or not. Um, and it because it shapes what problems you notice, what questions you find worth asking, which participants you identify, how they respond to you, how you relate to them, what you see in your data, how you write it up, and who you write it for. So here's something that often gets underemphasized with positionality. It doesn't just affect your study, it affects your participants, right? The power you hold, the relationships you bring to the study, the identities that you carry into the field work that you're doing, all of that is operating whether you talk about it or not. Being a scholar practitioner and conducting consequential research requires that you engage in a sustained, honest engagement with who you are, who you're accountable to, and whose knowledge you're centering. So, a few guiding questions on this slide for positionality. This probably looks familiar, some of this from 712, but these are things that you need to be thinking about, and you probably already have been thinking about as you develop your initial positionality statement. But like I said, this is an ongoing process. So this is something to continually reflect on and revise as you move through dissertation stage. So this is maybe the most important thing I want you to walk away with from this module specifically. Positionality is not a section of your dissertation. It's a practice that runs through the entire study. So think about each phase. In research design, the questions you ask, the methods you choose, whose voices you decide to prioritize and center, all of that is shaped by who you are. In data collection, your presence in the room, as an interviewer, even as the person who administers surveys, any of that, it's not neutral. Participants respond differently to different researchers. It's not really a problem to solve, but it is a dynamic to reflect on. In analysis, your chosen processes aren't neutral either, and your codes aren't objective categories that just emerge from data on their own, despite the fact that if you're doing qualitative research, you've probably read some scholarship that talks uh, about themes emerging from the data, right? The phrasing of that, there's pushback on that from some scholars. Others see that as making sure that the themes or the findings that you have don't transcend the data. But really, these categories and codes and things, you are developing them, right? And applying them to the data. And so whether you're framing that as emerging from the data or not, they're still shaped by you and your theoretical commitments and your experience. And then interpretation and writing, every framing decision, every word choice, every emphasis, that's a positionality decision. And the dissemination of your research is positionality as well, where you choose to share your findings, who you share it with, who you write for, whether you take your work back to the community in which you did your research. Those are all choices that reflect your values, your accountability, your commitment to reciprocity. So the point is, the reflection on positionality and how it fits into your research and how it affects your research, that doesn't stop when you finish the draft of your positionality statement and turn it in for your proposal, right? It runs throughout the entire study, all the way to the end and beyond. So what does a strong positionality statement actually do? Well, first, it goes beyond description. There's a difference between I am an administrator in a large urban district, and my experience as an administrator has shaped my attention to how institutional processes can simultaneously signal inclusion while producing inequitable outcomes. And that tension is one reason that I'm asking this question, right? So like that description of being an administrator, um, that's more analytic than the first, just saying I am an administrator in a large urban district. Strong statements are also, positionality statements are also dynamic. They acknowledge that your relationship to your research does change over time, that you might find yourself closer to or further from the problem as the study unfolds, because we change over the time that we're conducting studies. And naming that movement is actually a sign of reflection and rigor, it's not a limitation or a weakness of the study. Um, Positionality statements also connect the personal to the structural. So your individual identities don't exist in a vacuum. They sit within systems of power and access and knowledge production. And a strong statement makes that connection visible. And they name the tensions, right? So that's really difficult. Milner we've talked about Milner's work, racial and cultural considerations and research, as well as his work on consequential research. And he talks about shifting from the self to the system as being the most difficult move for most researchers, because it requires you to ask not just what you bring that's a strength, but what you bring that creates risk or limitations, for your participants, for your analysis, for the claims that you make. So the goal in this module is to move from having written a positionality statement to actually enacting positionality. And those are related, obviously, but different things. So let's stop here for just a quick reflection. Reflecting on the article that you chose to read, again, share one idea that you'll carry with you as you refine your positionality statement. And then please identify the reading that you chose in your response as well so that your classmates can see them. Right, so I want to talk a bit more about the foundations of positionality. Whoops. So this slide might look familiar from EDD 712, but I just want to give a brief review because these are the philosophical foundations that influence your research. They can be difficult concepts, right? It's something that you have to think about consistently. So first, ontology, which refers to the researcher's underlying philosophical assumptions about what reality is and how we understand it. So this is kind of um, the foundation or the umbrella for everything, right? Most pertinent to research is the ontological question, is there one reality or is reality context bound? Ontological perspectives can generally fall along a continuum from the belief that there's an objective reality, which would be realism, to the belief that reality is fully subjective, which would be relativism. So a researcher's ontological orientation influences their epistemological orientation, which is this next piece here. So generally, epistemology refers to our understanding of what knowledge is and how we produce it. So what can be known? How do we know something? Epistemologies are informed by your ontological assumptions. And then all research that you conduct is informed by those ideas, whether you acknowledge it or not. In general, a paradigm, this final one here, that's the belief system that guides our actions, and it comes from these ontological and epistemological perspectives. More specifically to research, paradigm's the basic belief or worldview that guides the investigator. So the paradigm is made up of ontology, epistemology, and then your experiences and background as well. All of that is the foundation for what we decide to research, how we decide to research it, and why. So, by examining those philosophical foundations, we can critically reflect on the research questions we ask, the methods we employ to address those questions, and then the lenses and frameworks through which we understand and make sense of those answers. Your epistemology provides the philosophical foundation for deciding what kinds of knowledge are possible. Um, and then your paradigm is that belief system that guides your actions. Putting all of that together, we can see the general orientation of ontologies, epistemologies, and paradigms along the continuum that ranges from most objective to most subjective. So that's independent of human consciousness to most dependent on human interpretation. So I want to note here that although I'm presenting this as kind of a continuum of perspectives, um, I and many other scholars don't see research as being able to be neutral or apolitical. So the idea that reality is objective or that objectivity as humans or as researchers is even really possible, um, that is that doesn't fit very well with the work that we do as scholar practitioners and educators and leaders because it overlooks how our own biases, assumptions, and backgrounds influence our work. And that's where your positionality comes in. So many of you, well, all of you, are doing research in systems where dominant epistemologies have historically silenced certain kinds of knowledge. Naming your paradigmatic commitments is part of how you push back on that. So that's not to say that you can't do equity and justice work from a post-positivist orientation. You absolutely can. It's just important to reflect on and be transparent about how that orientation influences your work. So, critical epistemology is the foundational claim that knowledge is never neutral. It's produced within systems of power and it either challenges or reproduces those systems. That's a strong claim and it has implications for how you design your study and what you do with your findings. Um, Feminist standpoint theory is another example of a critical and/or justice-oriented paradigm. Um, it adds that experience, particularly the experience of those most marginalized. Uh, it says that that in itself is a source of knowledge, not just a subject of a study, but a legitimate way of knowing. Patricia Hill Collins's Black feminist thought takes that further by naming the lived experiences of Black women as a generative epistemological standpoint in its own right. So one that dominant research traditions have systematically excluded. And then if you'll remember from EDD 712, we talked about Linda Tuhiwai Smith. Smith's decolonial framework challenges Western research itself as a colonial project and calls for research that's accountable to indigenous communities, not extractive from them. Um, then critical political economy, something called Marxist, sometimes called Marxist or materialist analysis in education. That centers class, labor, and economic conditions as fundamental to understanding educational inequity. If your study is touching on resource distribution, school funding, labor conditions, economic mobility, that this is a framework that names the structures beyond those patterns. So these are paradigms. Just expanding on some of the ones that we talked about in EDD 712. Um, the question for you then is which of these orientations resonates with how you actually understand knowledge? And is that visible in your positionality statement? And when I say which of these paradigms, I don't necessarily mean just the ones on this slide, but any of the ones that you've read about or come across. What do you, what resonates with you? Okay, so the questions on this slide are the ones I want you thinking about as you revise your positionality statement when you move forward with dissertation. What do you actually believe about reality? Do you think objectivity is possible? Most of you are working within critical frameworks. Most of you who are working within critical frameworks are going to say no, but no, objectivity is not possible. But if that's your answer, your positionality statement needs to say that clearly and explain what that means for how you're approaching your study. Same thing if you do see objectivity as being possible, that's something that should be showing up in your positionality statement as well and how that's influencing your study. So let's do another quick reflection. Where do you sit paradigmatically? Just right now. You don't need to do a bunch of research into, looking at different paradigms, but based on what you've read so far and what you've thought about in this program, where where do you align yourself paradigmatically? And does your current statement make that visible? If a reader finished your positionality statement and can't tell what paradigm was guiding your work, that's a gap that's worth addressing. Okay, so your positionality and your theoretical framework are in a two-way relationship. The frameworks you're drawn to often reflect your own experience, your values, your theory of change. That's part of your positionality. And once you've chosen a framework, it shapes what you see ultimately. So Maxwell, who you read last in the last module, or maybe the module before that, Maxwell's spotlight metaphor is really useful here. So your framework illuminates certain aspects of your data and leaves others not illuminated. Your positionality is part of what determines where that spotlight falls. So think about this in your own work. When you analyze through funds of knowledge or transformative leadership, or sense-making theory or critical race theory, what aspects of those frameworks are you most drawn to applying? What do those choices reveal about your own position? This is also why your positionality statement and your theoretical framework section belong in conversation with each other. They're both part of the same argument about why you are positioned to do this study and why you're approaching it the way that you are. Okay, so positionality, it's an ongoing process. I'm going to say this a few different times. So the tools on this slide, which I'll go deeper on a few of these in the slides ahead. Um, but the tools I'm mentioning here on the slide are practical infrastructure for that ongoing work. So think about them as a toolkit you're building, not just something you're kind of a checklist that you're completing once. So identity memos, for example, help you surface assumptions before and during data collection. Positionality notes help you track how your presence is operating in the field. Analytic memos document your reasoning during analysis. Peer debriefing brings in an outside perspective. Member checking, when it's done genuinely, not just as validation, invites participants to push back on your interpretations, or to confirm them if they are, in fact, in line with what your participants think. Audit trails create a record of your methodological decisions, and then bracketing asks you to consciously set aside your prior knowledge and expectations to make space for what participants are actually telling you. So think about what of these might feel most useful to you, and we're going to get into them in a little bit more depth here. Okay, so the identity memo. You may remember reading about this in Maxwell. This is a really useful tool for all doctoral students and researchers. The core idea is simple. Before you start your study, and then at key moments throughout it, you're writing for yourself in these identity memos, not for your committee, not for your participants, just for you. So this is a place where you can surface your assumptions, your expectations, your hopes, discomforts. Um, you examine what you already believe about the problem that you're studying and what you're maybe afraid that you'll find, or thinking about, confirmation bias. What do you think you'll find? And are you open to not finding what you think you'll find? Peshkin, another kind of foundational qualitative scholar, called this critical subjectivity. The goal isn't to eliminate your subjectivity. That's not really possible, and it's not even really desirable, especially in scholar practitioner work. The goal is to understand it clearly enough that it becomes a resource rather than just unexamined bias. So here's a practical question that's worth asking yourself. If I sat down tonight and I wrote an identity memo for my dissertation study, what would surprise me? What would I find uncomfortable to put on the page, about yourself, about the study? The discomfort is usually where the important work is. And the identity memo is also a powerful bridge between your theoretical framework and your positionality. It makes explicit the assumptions that sit between your stated framework and how you actually see the problem. Okay, so data collection. I think you already know this, but this is really where positionality gets very concrete very fast, especially for scholar practitioners. Most of you are conducting research inside systems where you already hold a role. You might be a principal studying your own teachers or students, a district administrator studying program implementation at a school where people know you, a dean studying the experiences of faculty you supervise, like those kinds of things. That insider position gives you access, right? Relationships, context, trust, but it also shapes every interaction you have during the study. So think about power differentials. If participants know you have authority over them in any form, that shapes what they tell you, not because they're lying, but because they're human, right? People calibrate what they share based on their sense of safety and consequence. Naming that dynamic in your positionality statement isn't, it's not optional, right? Like this is something that can really demonstrate how critically you've analyzed yourself in relation to your study, and also can help illuminate the influences of that relationship. Relational accountability and reciprocity is the flip side of that. So you owe something to the people who let you into their experience. What do they receive in return? And I don't mean like gift cards for participation. I mean more along the lines of what does their contribution do to better the world we live in, and how can you communicate that to them and for them? The positionality note after each data collection session is a simple kind of low lift habit that really pays dividends later when you're writing up your study. What did my presence make possible in that conversation? That's a question that you can reflect on and answer in these data collection memos. Um, what what did my presence do that might have changed how people responded? Could it have closed down any avenues of conversation? So you'll be glad when you're in analysis and when you're writing things up that you kept those notes and that you reflected on those things. Right, so positionality in analysis. I already talked about this a little bit, but codes are not neutral. The categories that you create, the things that you decide to call leadership or success, those choices reflect your theoretical commitments and your experiential lens. There's no view from nowhere. So that doesn't mean that your analysis isn't rigorous. It means that rigor requires naming the perspective from which you're analyzing. Confirmation bias is real for scholar practitioners. And so you need to be thinking about that and naming it. When you have strong convictions about what's wrong in your system, and most of you do, that's part of the idea of naming a problem of practice. Um, those convictions are probably right, but there's a pull toward finding exactly what you expected to find, not necessarily deliberately, but unconsciously. And your codes and categories can organize the data toward a predetermined conclusion. So some analysis of uh, doubt is the antidote to that. And Maxwell calls it the doubting game, right? After you've done your initial analysis, actively go looking for data that doesn't fit. What did participants say that surprised you? What patterns in the data push back on your theoretical, conceptual framework, or on the codes and categories that you've developed? What would a skeptic say about your interpretation, right? Could you justify the findings that you're finding or the interpretation that you're making? And an analytic memo is where you can put that work. You're not just documenting your findings. You can document your reasoning, your hesitations, the moments where you had to make a judgment call. That transparency makes your analysis defensible. Okay, so enacting positionality. Writing can feel like it's the end of the research process, but it's actually one of the most consequential sites of positionality. So when you write up your findings, you're making choices. Whose voices get the most space? What quotes do you pull? What do you emphasize? What do you contextualize? What do you let speak for itself? And it's not just qualitative data. That the same goes for the numbers and the data that you present. None of the choices that are being made there are neutral. So it's important to guard against just using participant voices and or numbers to say what you already wanted to say. Um, Selecting quotes that support your argument without genuinely engaging the complexity of what people told you, including things that might complicate your interpretation. So strong qualitative work, strong quantitative work, it sits with those contradictions. The language example on this slide is deceptively simple, but it goes deep. So something like students failed the test versus students were failed by the system, that describes the same event, but makes completely different claims about causality, agency, and accountability. If your theoretical framework is grounded in systemic analysis, your language should reflect that, and your positionality statement should explain why you're making that choice as well. Milner's work is useful here as well. Before you finalize a framing, and before you finalize your findings and your interpretation of your data, ask who benefits from it, whose interests it serves, who might be harmed by how you've told the story. And then dissemination, right? So that's where a lot of dissertations traditionally stop short of their potential. You do consequential research, you generate meaningful findings, and then the work sits in ProQuest, right? Where the people who are reading it are other doctoral students or researchers. But when we think about consequential research, Milner is asking you to think about this from the beginning. Who are your findings for? Who needs to know what you found? Who has the power to act on it? This is part of being a scholar practitioner. The communities and practitioners most affected by your research deserve access to it in a form that they can actually use. So reciprocity is one frame for this. If you've asked people to give you their time and their experience and their trust, what do you owe them in return? Think about things like what a one page brief to the school board would look like, something like that, or a professional development session grounded in your findings. Think about who in your organization has been waiting for the kind of documentation that your study is going to produce to exist. So, as scholar practitioners, you have something that university-based researchers don't often have, and that's direct channels to the people and institutions that your research is about. So, using those channels isn't it, it- that's good practice. It's completing the consequential research loop. Okay, so pulling all of that together, all of those tools, the identity memo is an anchor. It's something you can write before the study begins and continue to return to and use to reflect. It's where you can externalize your assumptions. Reflexive journaling is lower stakes, but that's something that can be cumulative. Analytic memos, brief notes after significant moments in the field, what surprised you, what you avoided, like those kinds of things. Over the course of a study, those memos and notes become an invaluable record of how your positionality was operating in real time. Um, Member checking, right? So you're asking your participants, this needs to be an authentic member checking. So not just sending them the transcripts and saying, like, is this, did you say this? It's more, did I get this right? Like, here are the themes that I'm finding. Here are the findings, the results of my study. Did I get it right? What am I missing? What am I misrepresenting or misinterpreting? Where is my framing not capturing your experience? That's a different way of framing member checking that actually elicits real engagement from your participants and collaborators. Um, Peer debriefing, right? You may need somebody who will push back on your interpretations, not just validate them. Someone who will say, is there a different way to look at this? That is something that you can engage in with your cohort members, or with others, as long as you're keeping the data anonymous, with others in your field. For your positionality statement, think about these tools, which ones you would commit to, how you'll name that, and discuss that commitment in your positionality statement. Because it does need to go beyond just, this is my positionality. It also needs to go into, here's what I'm going to do as part of my reflection on my positionality. Okay, so just a quick final slide on strengthening the positionality statement that I know you already have. So again, make sure you're shifting from description to analysis. If every sentence in your statement describes who you are without explaining how who you are shapes your research, then you have a little bit more work to do there. Make sure you shift from static to dynamic. Your relationship to the research isn't frozen at the moment you started the program or the moment you wrote your positionality statement. So you need to be continually reflecting on that. If anything has shifted for you, or if the problem has become more urgent, or if you've experienced something that changed how you see the problem, then you need to add that to the positionality statement. Move from the personal to structural. So this is Milner's shifting from the self to the system. Your individual experience doesn't exist outside of history and power. So making that structural connection is what separates a reflective statement from an analytical one. Move from comfortable to honest, right? What do you bring to this research that creates risk? Where does your bias exist? That's the question that many statements avoid. Very powerful positionality statements don't avoid that. And then the final point, your statement needs to explicitly connect to your theoretical framework. So a reader should finish your statement understanding not just who you are, but why this framework, this problem, this study, and they should understand how you plan to remain reflexive. So what are those tools that you're going to use, and what does that look like in practice? Um, and make sure you've situated this all in your paradigmatic beliefs as well. Okay, so in closing, I'd like you to choose one of these plumps, one of these prompts to respond to. What do you think you will do to maintain ongoing engagement with your positionality and its influence on your study? Which of the tools that we've talked about will you use? Or what are the strengths of your existing positionality statement that you think you'll need to strengthen slash revise? All right.